Okay, we're going to pick up here today with on page 26 of your contracts package. We're going to complete the clauses and contingencies addendum form today. And we are in page 26 2C. I believe that's where we left off. Unrepresented seller or builder and buyer's broker. So if you actually have the buyer broker agreement signed by the buyer, you are their agent, and you are going to show a for sale by owner or using our builder contract, new home contract, then you would use this paragraph unless the property is, that builder's property is listed. So this is when the builder or the seller is unrepresented, you have a buyer broker agreement, okay? Couple things. If you're going to go out and show a for sale by owner home or an unlisted home, there are several things you need before you go. One, a right to show letter, getting permission to show the property. Two, the commission request up front, and the unrepresented party form, which we'll take a look at here in a second. Code of Ethics requires that you discuss the compensation at first contact, not first contract. You will reflect the commission here, but you should have that all agreed to before you show the property. Generally, the way I approach that, rather than calling an owner and say, well, you pay a commission, I generally use something like this. My client, the buyer, has instructed me to contact you to see if you would be willing to reimburse the compensation of X% on their behalf per my written agreement to represent them. So I don't want the owner to think that I'm a greedy real estate agent looking for money from somebody who's trying to save money, but my client is requesting this, okay? That's the best way, I think, to handle that. So let's take a look at the actual paragraph here. Upon seller's irrevocable instruction, and that's similar language to paragraph 24, where they agree to pay the compensation per listing contract on that date. It is understood and agreed by all parties that the cooperating broker's name, and that is your name, of the cooperating broker's firm, and that is the Office of Fairfax Realty, which you are working with, is acting as an agent solely representing buyer in this transaction, buyer's broker. That means you do have the written buyer broker agreement signed before you leave the office and show a property. And you know, in Virginia, you cannot be representing someone unless they have given you written instructions to be their agent. There is no oral buyer broker agreement. There are no cultural cutouts. You need that agreement signed. We do not have sub-agency in the state of Virginia, so please, please protect yourself, okay? Seller agrees to pay buyer's broker a payment of, if it's a cash amount of money, in cash, or a percent of the total sales price. So when you fill out the buyer broker agreement, whatever you're asking as the buyer broker, you may even want to ask at that point for, the fee that your buyer pays. You could include that in there. So you could have a percentage in the amount of money, that additional money. Don't put, and I see this quite often with buyer broker agreements, and it says where you're going to get paid, it says per listing agreement, okay? That is very dangerous, because what if the listing says 0? Are you willing to work for nothing? So make sure you put a percentage in there, whatever it is that you've agreed that your buyer will pay you to be reimbursed, hopefully on their behalf by a third party. So also with this situation here, if you said as per MLS agreement, there is no MLS agreement. So what does that mean? Okay, so spell it out, put a dollar amount or a percentage in your buyer broker agreement. Settlement agent is hereby irrevocably directed to deduct buyer's broker fee from seller's proceeds of the sale at settlement. The parties acknowledge that the buyer's broker relationship was disclosed to seller and or seller's agent prior to showing property to buyer. Okay. Now, I want you to go to page 33 and let's discuss that disclosure form that they are talking about. It's called Disclosure of Brokerage Relationship for Unrepresented Parties. Okay, so if you go to page 33, when is the only time that this form is ever necessary in the state of Virginia? Can someone tell me, unmute yourself and tell me, when's the only time you ever have to use this form?
If as a listing agent, you are representing a buyer?
Okay, well, you wouldn't be representing, don't use that term, okay?
Okay, right.
that would indicate you had a buyer broker agreement also. So when you have an unrepresented party, so you can sell your own listing to someone,
Right.
not become a dual agent, correct? By keeping them as a customer.
Right.
That would be an example of when you use this form, right? So here's what you have to remember about this form. This form is only used when one party to the transaction has an agent and the other party does not. Okay, so you sign me up to a buyer broker agreement today. You are my agent, right? You're going to go out and you're going to show me a listing that you found in the Bright MLS system. I want to buy that property. Do you use this form in that transaction? No. Why not? Okay. The reason you don't, both parties have an agent. So in the state of Virginia, if both parties have an agent, you do not use this form, even if the other side says they require it. Okay. You take me out to show me a for sale by owner, correct? Take me out to show me a for sale by owner. Would this form be necessary?
No.
It would be necessary. Why? Does the for sale by owner have an agent?
No.
So does the buyer have an agent?
Well, kind of, yeah. I had a weird situation about a year ago because I had a buyer client and she found this FSBO home, but there were two guys in there. They were not agents, but they said they were there on behalf of the seller. They never left the house at all.
Well, they were representing the illegally. That was a violation of our state law.
Yes,
okay.
And so she did decide to get the house, and all throughout they were always there. We never saw the seller.
Yeah, well, they were operating illegally in the state of Virginia. Okay, because unless you're the owner, you can't represent someone unless they had power of attorney. Now, if they had power
This was
of attorney,
actually in DC's.
Well, DC, okay. Well, I'm talking Virginia. Okay. I'm not sure of DC. I gave up my license there years ago. Okay. So in Virginia, if one party to the transaction has an agent, the other one doesn't, then this form is necessary. So when you're showing a for sale by owner, the for sale by owner, or just the owner that you just knock on their door and they say, yeah, I'll sell my house. Well, this form is necessary right up front with that party. You must use it right up front, okay? Because our law says before any substantive discussion about a specific property with a party that you do not represent, if you are representing another party, in this instance, the buyer by written brokerage agreement, then this form must be used, okay? Now, I'm saying this form has to be used because it's prepared by NVAR. It makes it easy. The law just says they have to be put on written notice, okay? Now, the law does not say the other party has to sign the form. You have to present to them in writing that you're representing the other side. That's all the law requires. If they refuse to sign, then what I want you to do is put the property address still and your name and all on this form, date it and state that this form was presented to the buyer and they did not want to sign it. And that's fine, as long as you can prove that you presented it. So how is this form properly used? Once again, remember, if the property is listed, okay, and write MLS, the other side has an agent, the form isn't necessary. But you're showing me, your buyer client, you're showing me this for sale by owner's home. So which box would be checked? Seller or buyer? Well, the box you check is the party that has an agent, okay? The only party that signs the form is the party that does not have an agent. If you are a buyer broker, you have a buyer agency agreement, never, ever, ever let your buyer sign this form, okay? So let's try this. The undersigned, unrepresented parties do hereby acknowledge disclosure that the licensee, that would be you, and since I'm an associate broker, not the principal broker of the firm, let's just use my name, Larry Anderson, or if you don't have a broker's license, a salesperson, your name, associated with Fairfax Realty of Tyson's, the office that I would use, represents only the following party in a residential real estate transaction. Look at those words. Represents only the following party in a residential real estate transaction. Cannot use this in a commercial transaction. It's residential only, okay? For the sale or lease of the property. So it's not only just for sale, but it's also lease, right? And it's property specific. You can't use one form to show multiple properties that are not listed. You need a different form for each one because it has to be presented to that party prior. So now you have a buyer broker agreement with me. You are going to show me an unlisted property. Then you would check buyer, okay? Because the following party, the buyer, has an agent. And the party that has to acknowledge they don't have an agent is the seller. You with me?
Yep.
Okay. Now, let's say you're holding an open house. It doesn't even have to be your listing, but it has to be your company's listing. You can't hold an open house for another agent from an office that you don't belong to. You understand that? Because our state law says the only way you can represent someone is to have a written agreement with that party. And if it's a different office, say Century 21 office, and you have a friend there that wants you to hold an open house, you can't do it because you'd be representing that party and you don't have a written agreement to do that. But you can hold open, say Nestor has a listing that he wants held open. I could hold his listing open, okay? Now, someone walks in to see the house. What is the question that I have to ask them? before we do anything else.
Do you have a written agreement with an agent?
Okay, so our code of ethics says, have you entered into a written exclusive right to be represented brokerage agreement with another party? Excellent. If I say yes, then you're fine. If I say no, now you need to do this disclosure of brokerage relationship. Okay, because even though it's not your listing, it is the company's listing, and you're a representative of the company, which means you are the agent of the seller through the company. So this form would be necessary. So we'd fill out the top the same way, but in this instance, okay, who has the agent?
Who has the what?
Who has the agent if you're holding an open house?
Who has the agent? The seller.
The seller, absolutely. Otherwise, you couldn't be there holding the open house, right? So you would check seller, who would be the only party that would have to sign the form.
It would be
The buyer, I think.
The buyer, absolutely, the buyer, because you're in a seller's house, you're representing that seller. You ask that buyer, do you have an agent? They said no. So now we have one unrepresented party, okay? And it says in our statute, before you have any substantive discussion about a specific property, you're holding an open house, right? Do you think you're going to have substantive discussion about that property with that buyer? Of course you are. So protect yourself, okay? Our law says you have to tell them right up front, and at the earliest possible time, get it in writing, okay? So we would actually, and the way that I handle this, quite frankly, is on top of the sign-in sheets that I use, I put all parties entering the property acknowledge the agent is representing the buyer. We have what we call safe harbor language in the state of Virginia. So if you look at your agency statute, your actual agency statute, it has what they call safe harbor language for protecting yourself under this disclosure requirement in the state of Virginia. And it's a sentence long. You could add that to the top of your sign-in sheet, and when they sign in, asking them to acknowledge that. But if I am going to then have real substantive discussion with the party, so that's one way to protect yourself when they first walk in. But if I'm going to have real substantive discussion, I am going to pull this form out and use it. And I know you're going to tell me no one does this. Well, I can tell you one person that does it, and that is Larry Anderson, because I know what our law says. Okay? So protect yourself, use the form, and remember, the only time this form is necessary, one party has an agent, the other party does not, then the requirement of disclosure of unrepresented party. Now, why did I say you never let your buyer's agent, your buyer client, sign this form, okay, where it says buyer? Because it says right here on the form, the undersigned unrepresented party. When you have your buyer sign this form, they're saying they're unrepresented. Don't do that. Don't take that chance, right? So there should only be one signature on this form at any time. It could be two buyers or two sellers, but the only one should be signing the form, okay? And when the other side on a listed property calls and says, well, our firm requires the disclosure of brokerage relationship form, just ask them to please send it over saying that they're representing the seller, okay? And you will present it to your buyer, but they cannot sign it because they have an agent, all right? So, or just have them call your manager, and your manager will explain to them why we don't do it, or send it over blank, okay? Send it over blank if necessary. But that's what they're talking about here when we look at that contingencies and clauses addendum where it says by prior disclosure. Is everyone clear on this form? Because you need to use it properly. If you're not, speak up. This is the best time to know, not when a situation arises.
Larry,
Yes,
you mentioned about safe harbors language. Where do we get that?
it's in our agency statute. I don't have it here in front of me, but it basically says the undersigned party acknowledges that, well, it's basically that top language on the top of this form, okay? Acknowledges that you associated with the firm represents the following party. So you could actually use the language here on the top, but the safe harbor language is in our agency statute itself. I'll try to have that up for you in the next meeting, okay? Or you
Thank
can
you.
just Google agency statute in the state of Virginia.
Okay.
I have it over here in my other teaching stuff. I'm actually teaching that on Friday for NVAR for continuing ed. I'm doing agency and ethics mandatory class for agents, but I don't want to go over there and dig it out right now. Okay, but it's just like that's like for dual agency. It's like for any of these things. There's what we call safe harbor language in our statute. Okay. Yes, somebody had a question.
Yes, Larry, if the unrepresented party did not sign the disclosure or the form, how can you be paid as an agent? If
What our statute says is we have to present this to them. It does not say they have to sign it. So if the unrepresented party does not want to sign, you still want to fill the form out for the property address. Okay.
But
And
how will he be paying you from the sales price if he doesn't sign?
well, the buyer, this unrepresented party would not be paying you. Okay.
Who's going to be paying you?
Well, the person you had the buyer broker agreement with has agreed to pay you.
I see.
Okay. Now we're going to go back to our contingencies and clauses, and I think I understand your question, and I will answer that. But one thing it's required, if it's an unrepresented party under that contingencies and clauses addendum, this form is necessary. Okay. Now so I'll readdress that when we go back to it. Okay. And that contingencies and clauses. I think I understand your concern and your question. Okay. But this is a required thing. So if they won't sign this form, okay, you never mention commission, you don't add anything to this form. This form is only purpose is to make sure one party understands the other one has representation, they don't. Okay. Then if they won't sign it, date the form yourself. Make a note that they refuse to sign it. Okay, you could even ask them to initial it. Just a lot of times they will initial it, but wouldn't sign it. And keep it in your folder in case anything comes back later. Okay with that? Okay, let's go back to the contingencies and clauses addendum form. Let me find it because I covered it up here. Okay, so we're going back to page 26. Unrepresented seller, right, or builder. So you have that unrepresented seller. Remember, I told you when we started, there are several forms you need. A right to show letter, okay, that allows you to get into the property, and you need to ask for the commission. So that right to show letter might ask for that commission, and the unrepresented party form, so they acknowledge they don't have representation. Now you ask for the commission, and like I said, the way I always do it, Mrs. Seller, my client, the buyer, who I have a written brokerage agreement, has asked if you would be willing to reimburse the compensation of X% per my written brokerage agreement to represent my buyer. You know, and if you are, they would like to see your property. Now, that covers you who pays you. The buyer has agreed to pay you, And it says anything reimbursed on their behalf will be credited towards what's owed you. So once that seller agrees to pay that compensation by that separate agreement before you show the listing, okay, then it would be reflected again here in this paragraph where this FSBO is agreeing to pay your company X amount of dollars, okay? But you can't just send a contract over with this paragraph filled out if you didn't ask for the compensation before the transaction began. Now, that is a violation of the Code of Ethics. You'll get your money, but you might be found in violation of the Code of Ethics. Okay? Did that answer the question about how you're going to get paid? It's just like with a listing agreement. You get the buyer broker agreement signed, and the buyer agrees to pay you X amount of compensation, and anything credited towards that amount, okay, will be credited towards what they owe you, and they basically owe you the difference. So you're doing the same thing here.
So buyer will pay anyway, right? In this case,
Do what?
buyer will pay, right? Not the
Yes.
seller will pay.
The buyer will pay, but you ask the buyer up front to reimburse that compensation on their behalf. So I would sit down with my buyer client and I'd say, look, I know you want to see this for sale by owner. Realize we have this agreement where you have to pay us. I am requesting on your behalf that they pay if you buy, if you buy that property. Okay. So I'm going to make that request. I come back and I say, well, they said no. Okay. They won't reimburse. Then if you'd like to see that property, you understand you still owe us the money. Or you can say, I've done a good job here for you. I've requested they reimburse the compensation. They have agreed to do that in writing. Now your buyer's even more happy, right? So protect yourself. It's spelled out in a buyer broker agreement. This is where they would actually, the seller would agree to pay you. Now, you'll notice this is also for a builder. This is not for a builder like Pulte, okay? You don't go in there using this with Pulte. They have their own agreements and own contract. This is for a builder, a little individual builder, okay? You might want to use our new home contract that is not meant for going out and trying to negotiate with a Pulte or Horton or whoever the builder is you're using. Okay. Now, if the property is listed, that builder's property is listed, you don't use this paragraph. This is only when that builder is building that house. They're not putting an MLS. They do not have an agent. Then you would use this paragraph. Okay. Any other questions about paragraph C? Okay, let's talk about 1031 exchanges. Okay, we didn't realize it was a holiday on Monday. I logged on anyway. We had a couple people on and we had a little discussion about 1031 exchange, etc. Had a nice little private session. I think it was 3 of us, maybe 4 on Monday. I want to discuss it here. It's part of this contingencies and clauses. A 1031 exchange, you cannot use a 1031 exchange for a personal residence, okay? It can only be for investment properties. When they talk like-kind exchange, it does not have to be a condo for another condo. Does not have to be a single-family home for another single-family home. Does not have to be an apartment complex for another apartment complex. Any property, real property that was held for investment can be traded for another piece. So you could trade a condo for a piece of land, okay? You could trade a piece of land for an apartment building. So 1031 exchange is for investment property only, right? So paragraph D is if the buyer needs to do a 1031 exchange. Property is being acquired to complete an IRC, Internal Revenue Code Section 1031, tax deferred exchange pursuant to an exchange agreement. The settlement will be coordinated with, and that's what they call the intermediary. Now, when it comes to a 1031 tax-free exchange, the money can never be in the control of the owner of the property. So you need what we call an intermediary, okay? I use Realty Exchange Corporation, William Horan. If you have somebody that wants to do this, you need to have this intermediary right up front. Get them involved, because the seller will really be Realty Exchange Corporation, not your seller on the contract. So it needs to be done properly, okay? Who will instruct seller as to the manner property shall be conveyed to buyer. There should be no additional expense to seller as a result of the exchange, and seller shall cooperate with buyer and intermediary in completion of the exchange. Now, paragraph E deals with the seller. Now, there's some time frames that you have to meet, okay? There's some time frames that have to be met. It's called 45-180. Therefore, you really need to make sure that they have this representation of an intermediary right up front, okay? Day one of the 45 days is closing of the property. So on day one, they close. Day 2 to day 44, that's what we call the identification period. The exchanger researches properties to require replacement properties. They have to identify one or more properties that they might purchase, okay? Day 45, they have to identify those properties in writing. Then they have from day 45 to day 180 to close on one of those properties. And they can't mess up. They can't miss a date. If they go past 180 days for settlement, it is now a taxable sale, okay? And the reason that someone does a 1031 tax-free exchange is to delay the payment of taxes, not wipe them out, delay them, okay? Now, and if you're the person representing them in a tight market and you can't find a property and they settle in that 180-day period, they are going to be paying quite a bit of tax on that sale. Now, we discussed this on Monday. I'm a single guy, okay? I'm not married. I sell a property. I've lived in that property at least 2 years of the previous 5. Doesn't have to be 2 years in a row. I could live there year 1. I could rent it out for 2 years and then live it in it year 4. And I could sell it, and it's the first $250,000 of the profit is still tax-free because I did have it as my primary residence 2 of the previous 5 years. A married couple, $500,000. Okay, so the first $500,000 every 2 years is tax-free. Okay, and that's our tax code. But if it was an investment property, it's going to be taxed probably at 25% unless I can delay those taxes. Now, here's a situation to remember. I bought my first house in South Arlington on 8th Street South, Alcova Heights, back in 1969, okay? Right out of college. Lived in an apartment for 3 months, couldn't take it, bought a house. $19,500 for a single family home. Let's say that I still owned that house. It was sold 2 years ago for $1 million, and it was torn down to build another house. Unfortunately, I didn't still own it. But I'm a single guy, and that property I paid 19, and I had some closing costs, so my adjusted basis might have been 22.5, okay? So if it sold for $1 million, well, then the first 272.5 would be tax-free, okay? However, the rest of it would be a taxable event. So if you've had somebody that's lived in a home for a long, long time, and they need all the equity out of their property to buy their next home, they may not have that because it's going to be taxable. So then the question is, well, could I do a 1031 tax-free exchange on this? No, I couldn't because it was my primary residence. I would literally have to move out of the house, turn it into an investment property, and I'm going to say, I can't give them legal advice, but at least rent it for a year or more, okay? And then I might be eligible for a 1031 tax-free exchange to buy a property wherever I wanted to retire. But then I'm going to have to rent that property out for at least a year before I move into it. So it's just too hard to try to coordinate this unless I had some other properties I own that I could move into and live for a while. So when they want to know if they can do a 1031 exchange on their personal residence, they're going to have to turn it into an investment property. They need probably more advice than we can legally give them because we don't want to practice, securities and all that other type stuff without a license. Now, 1031 exchange, E, seller and buyer agree to transfer property by utilizing this 1031 tax deferred exchange. Buyer agrees to cooperate with seller at no expense or liability to the buyer in completion of the exchange, including execution of all necessary documents, the intention of the parties being that seller utilizes section 1031 to defer taxes by acquiring like-kind real estate through an exchange agreement established at settlement. The parties will execute all necessary documents as determined by the intermediary at settlement, which documents are prepared at seller's expense. So because basically the intermediary is going to be the purchaser, and then the title's transferred to the seller. It's a pretty complicated transaction. You need somebody who really knows what they're doing. And one of the keys to this, you need that intermediary that will be there throughout the whole transaction, because if anything happened to the intermediary and they pulled out, then it's a taxable event for your seller. You don't want to end up in that. So William Horan, Realty Exchange Corporation, they have a good website. They have a lot of information on their website. When I get back, I'm coming back on the 22nd. I am actually going to contact William and see if he'll do a 1031 session for us in one of our sessions instead of me. Maybe we'll get him to discuss 1031 exchanges. Any questions? Okay, then let's finish up with paragraph F, and we will actually be finished with this contingencies and clauses addendum session. Cooperative. There's a few co-ops here in Virginia, okay? What you have to realize with a co-op, you're not buying real estate. You are basically buying stock in a corporation that gives you the right to occupy the space. So there's only a few lenders that will do this. You need to actually find out all that information before putting your party in one of these co-ops. But seller has delivered or will deliver the buyer the required public offering statement. That's because it is stock. If the statement was delivered prior to the date of ratification, then the buyer has 10 days from the date of ratification to void this contract by delivering notice to seller. Okay. Remember, we have a notice to void the contract, right? And that is page 38 of your package. If the statement was delivered after the date of ratification, then the buyer will have 5 days from receipt of the statement or date of settlement, whichever occurs first, to void the contract by delivering a notice to the seller. Also remember that in these things, you have to coordinate a co-op purchase with when the co-op board will be meeting, because they actually have to approve the purchaser. So it takes a little bit more with a co-op. So if you're going to be dealing with a co-op, talk to me or one of the managers before you get involved in that. Except as modified by this addendum, all terms and provisions of this contract are hereby expressly ratified and confirmed and will remain in full force and effect. And that language is necessary on any addendum that is not referenced in this contract. That's a lot to be thrown at you in one day. Any questions about any of that?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
It is not 1031, but it's inversion property. For taxes purposes, we still pay, if we live 2 years, we still, we can have the,
If it's an investment property,
yes, but it's not
you-
1031.
so an investment property is a taxable sale unless you were to move into that investment property, make it your primary residence for at least 2 years, then you would probably, not have to pay income tax, but you would have to pay tax on anything that you had used as a depreciation on that property. But you need to talk to a tax CPA or an accountant. We are not qualified to give that type of advice to clients.
I see.
So I can tell them my opinion, but refer them to an expert.
Okay, thank you very much.
And after this election, we'll have to wait and see how this election goes. A lot of this stuff, because one of the parties is talking about these loopholes for, that need to be closed financially, and 1031 tax-free exchange and these other things might be some of the things they look at to try to raise tax money. So, these things are all subject to change. So, stay on top of them. That's why I always refer them to an expert about any of these matters. I know how to discuss it, but I refer them to experts. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to start the well and septic inspection addendum. Next Wednesday, we will do the well and septic inspection addendum. It is Form K1360. Okay. Form K1360 at NVAR's forms. And we will pick that up. It's not in your contracts package, so please download that form for next week's session. And if there's no other questions, we'll call it a day. Thank you for joining me.
Larry, it's next Wednesday or next Monday?
Well, next Monday we do Ask Larry. Okay.
Okay.
And Wednesdays are always back to basics. So with Ask Larry, I'm going to be talking about voiding of a contract by seller. Do they have any right to do that? We're going to talk about power of attorney. What if a party dies? And time is of the essence, and personal property situations. So on Mondays, I like to talk about situations that agents actually had in the week or two previous. So 11 o'clock on Monday, we will do Ask Larry. Wednesday is back to basics, where we go through forms line by line.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. If there's no other questions, thank you for joining me, and I will see hopefully most of you back on Monday. And these are recorded, so when Nestor gets a chance to put it up, you can go back and revisit these on our YouTube channel. Okay.